Okay, so I would like to introduce our guest today. Edward Mullany is the author of If I Falter at the Gallows, Figures for an Apocalypse, and Three Sunrises. I believe all three of those were published by Publishing Genius Press. Great press.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
also the creator of the comic strips Rachel and Ben, Excerpts from a Boring Man's Diary. And I've been seeing you, well, not super recently, but last year I know that you were doing like a series of religious figures, mainly saints, at least on
yeah. The
Instagram and
Saints,
maybe
calendar
elsewhere.
of Saints.
Calendar of
No,
Saints.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I did that last year.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah,
you kind of brought that to a close.
yeah, I did. I it's looks sort of funny because I started it in so I started it in August, kind of at a random time on the,
Okay.
during the year. I think it was August 15th. And then I ended up doing one per day because I wanted to do a saint for each day of the calendar, which in the
Awesome.
Catholic Church there's a certain number of saints that are commemorated on each day. So I would choose one and as I went along, and I went, and so I went from August 15th, and I went around all the way through the calendar year 2023 into 2020. No, sorry, 2022. I began it in
Okay.
August, and I came around and then finished it in August 14th of 2023. So I did get them all. But
That's
yeah, that's how it
awesome.
went. So
That's
so when I
crazy.
got
That's
around,
cool that you
yeah,
did it every day.
around August, I ended. Yes, it was a quite a process, and it was it was a little bit tiring,
Sure.
a little bit a little bit exhausting and relatively, I would say.
Yeah.
Um, but because I wasn't I don't draw fast enough that I could get very far ahead of myself, you know.
Right.
So I was sort
Right.
of basically working on one each day for the next day.
Right.
So it felt like in some ways it was just like a normal kind of like um, project, but in another way it was like sort of like almost like a physical thing that I was working on it each day because I needed to get it done for the next
Yeah,
day.
it was like
But
labor.
yeah,
Well, I love, welcome to the podcast, Edward. I'm so glad you're here. It's great to see you.
thank you. It's great
Yeah.
to see you too.
Yeah. Well, I've always admired that you work in different creative modes and stuff. And so I'm happy to hear that you've still, as you were saying before we pressed record, that you're still writing and doing visual art pretty regularly. And so
Pretty regularly, yeah. It
pretty regularly.
it
Yeah,
comes.
I know it comes in waves for me as well. So I have a list of questions that I want to ask you. We'll see if we get to them all. Who knows?
Okay,
But we'll talk more about some creativity in a bit. But the first question I wanted to
okay,
ask you is one that I've asked a lot of guests, and it actually comes from a Zen koan, like an old Zen
okay.
story.
Yeah.
And the question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to? And so I'm curious about your
Okay,
response to
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I have to tell you. So I was like looking at a couple of your earlier podcasts, and,
Yeah,
and I saw you ask this question. So
I
I feel like it's
figured
a little unfair to you because I heard you ask. I was like, that's a really interesting
that's
question.
totally fine.
No,
I'm
I like
curious
that.
what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So can you read it again one more time?
Yeah. So all things return to the one. Where does the one return to?
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I don't know how to answer that really because it's a riddle sort of as they are,
Yeah.
which, but if I had to, which I will try to, is that I sort of think of, um, I mean, you know that I come from the Catholic tradition,
Yep.
and so that kind of informs the way that I would even respond to this, even though it's like an Eastern kind of
Sure.
construction
I
or
figured,
Eastern
yeah.
thought, you know. Um, but it is interesting to me in that sense because the first thing that I thought of when I heard that is like the idea of the alpha and the omega,
Hmm.
which is like the first and the last. But that was just kind of something that came into my head, which I don't think sort of makes a very accurate connection with that particular riddle or koan.
Hmm.
Um, but the idea of in the Christian sense of a God that's outside of time. That would be so in my sense, that's kind of like the one that everything comes out of, and then also returns to.
Hmm.
The but the I suppose the thing of it being outside of time or outside of creation is what makes that unique to me, or unique to that way of responding to it.
So would you say that,
That all of creation comes out of the one and all of it returns to it.
okay, so you would say that, all things return to that God outside of time, and then the God outside of time kind of returns to all things by kind of continuing to create the universe or something?
Something like that. Something like that. I suppose it doesn't make a exact parallel or exact analogy, but that's kind of where my mind goes to.
Sure. No, yeah, that's what I'm curious about. I mean, I never want the person responding to feel like they have to kind of keep it aligned with like Eastern thought or something. I like that
Hmm.
question because I feel like it does kind of it can be applied to many different spiritual orientations, and even philosophical orientations. So, yeah, well, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Hmm.
So, yeah, continuing kind of on this topic of religion because I that's well, religion and spirituality are kind of possibly my favorite things to think about and reflect on and read about and talk to people about. And they have been for many, many years. And so even though this podcast kind of started as a way of asking people about unusual experiences that they've had, because I'm also very interested in that, and the two, of course, overlap. But it kind of ended up turning into me just talking to people about their own spirituality or lack thereof. I've had a few people who don't really like to use the word spiritual to describe themselves, and that's cool too. I'm interested in that as well. But I know that
Hmm.
you're a religious person, and so I wanted to ask some questions about that. Um, so
Yep.
first off, like, can you describe the sort of religious environment that you grew up in?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Um, I grew up in a going to Catholic school and attending Catholic Mass on Sundays, more or less each Sunday when I was a child. Um, I grew up in a family of seven children, and so my parents were Catholic. Um, I'm not sure how if that is how they would. I would leave it to them to describe how Catholic they are.
Yeah.
Um, if someone were to ask them, of course. Um, but it was enough for me to have um, grown up in that environment, just going to Catholic schools and going to Mass on Sundays, to at some point later in my life, once I was an adult, to start taking it more seriously. I wasn't to say that you don't take it seriously as a child, but you don't own you're not sort of in full possession of your faith as a child, which is natural. You're a child, even
Yeah.
once you're past the age of reason, which I think is seven or something. You have to go through your teenage years, you have to go through your early adulthood, and sort of um, go through that time of um, questioning um, your faith and ideas of being and reality, and also looking with a critical eye on the very church itself. If you're a Christian or if you're a Catholic, as I am,
Hmm.
and it takes some time. But I think that just that childhood that I described, which is not an unusual one, I don't think was enough for me to um, once I did start taking it seriously to um, make something important out of. To me, it's of utmost importance. There's nothing more
Okay.
important, I think, um, in a person's existence and in reality than in understanding um, where we're coming from and where we're going to and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were younger and you were kind of going through the stages of questioning and kind of like figuring out your own sense of reality and having direct experiences that were shaping your belief system and stuff, um, did you ever kind of consider yourself an agnostic or an atheist through those younger periods?
Hmm.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say so. I think you know, just even in high school, once beginning high school, I probably started. Um, I mean, so when I was a kid, it was just like you go to church because you have to,
Hmm.
and it's not very enjoyable. And but I mean, I was a curious child, and I think I sort of took things in, and I absorbed a lot.
Yeah.
So that was probably good. A lot of things stay with me, but I also um, went through that stage of not really taking it seriously or not being sure if it was actually true, had truth to it.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe you even during those years, it's not as though you feel one way. It probably goes in ups and downs because you encounter as you go along people um, who are truly faithful people, I suppose is the way that I would put it, and they make you realize that here's someone who really takes it seriously and
Yeah.
embodies what this thing would seem to be about. Then of course you see other versions of it where it's like this really isn't very serious. This seems frivolous, or this
Hmm.
person is, you know, children and teenagers can be judgmental. I mean
Yeah.
they and in a way they ought to be. They need to. They're trying to figure. We want to know what is truth, and we look to
Yeah.
see how people are embodying that. But anyway, so yeah, high school, college, especially in early college, um, I went to a Jesuit college, Creighton University, as an undergraduate in Omaha, Nebraska. But I mean, it's the sort of liberal minded, and you study different religions and so on. And I remember I took classes on world religions and so on, and I became interested for a time in what Muslims believe, what Hindus believe, especially in Buddhism. I became interested in,
Yeah.
and I would say even that Buddhism, especially in Tao. I think you say Taoism.
Yeah.
I sometimes read it Taoism. Taoism.
Yeah.
I read, they're sort of like some of their holy books or
Sure.
whatnot, like the Tao Te Ching and
Yeah.
some writings by Buddhists, and that those are fascinating and interesting, and there's value in them.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really until I would say my later 20s that I began to just kind of there wasn't anything that I have had a sort of dramatic religious or personal mystical experiences or instances of
Mm.
personal revelation or anything of that sort. It's been for me more of the it's been for me more of quite a rational path, the path of reason. And um you know Catholicism is, I think it was Thomas Aquinas who emphasized the fact that to be a Catholic is to have to know God is through faith and reason. It's not
Hmm.
just through blind faith. It's we've been given our mind for a reason. It's a beautiful thing. You use it to understand the world, and so it's faith and reason can bring us to a perfect knowledge of God. I don't think anyone would say, but you can arrive at a kind of place um, where you feel you have are in connection with the truth.
Hmm.
And um, so yeah, late 20s and then into my 30s, and of course until now, it's been a long, slow process, and I still feel as though I'm still kind of working personally to integrate myself more fully into um, um, an active life within the Catholic Church, and I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, where I've um, I've separated myself from God through, through my own sin and just through sort of error, because um, I did say that it was in my late 20s that I kind of returned more fully to the Catholic Church, and that was more sort of like an intellectual thing. It wasn't with my whole heart and my active life. I'll stop there because I don't want to keep going on. But does that answer
No,
that
that's great. Yeah,
for you?
that's a lot. Yeah. I mean, that's some interesting material there. So yeah, well, number one, I it makes sense that you resonated also with Buddhism and Taoism a little bit when you were kind of exploring it, because I feel like your writing sometimes reminds me of, it's almost got a Buddhist flavor to it or something, you know? It's very kind of
Yeah,
minimalist
like
and this clear kind of lucid uh contact with direct mundane reality. It's kind of Zen in a way, you know? Um,
I think that it influenced me, especially my first book was a book of poems. I think you mentioned it, If I Fall
yeah,
to
I
the
like that one a
Gallows.
lot.
I mean, I was definitely influenced by like some of that imagery, of the Eastern spirituality.
I can see
And
it.
Kerouac is a big was one of my sort of my literary heroes, and he
Nice.
was a Catholic actually, but
Oh
he
yeah,
was greatly influenced by Buddhism, and he loved it, and I would say that he even sort of integrated a lot of it, not
absolutely.
only the aesthetics but the spirituality into his own faith. I
Yeah.
don't feel as though I feel as though I respond to that as well.
Yeah,
The Eastern art is beautiful.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, I really like Chinese and Japanese landscape paintings, and I like koans, I like haikus, all that. And I also was definitely influenced by Kerouac, especially in my kind of early 20s. And he was part of the reason why I started getting interested in Buddhism and Buddhism, because he didn't necessarily talk about Taoism or Hinduism much or at all. But
That's
I
true. Yeah.
explored those as well. But yeah, he was, he kept his Catholic faith pretty strong, and maybe even got increasingly strong as he got older. But he never really abandoned certain Buddhist yeah, he was integrating Buddhism on one level or another throughout his life, it seemed. And
Yeah, he
Dharma
loved
Bums
it.
is one of my
The,
favorite books by
the
Kerouac, and that was all about Buddhism in a lot of ways.
yes, the Dharma bombs, and also what's that other one? The one about the mountain that he goes on top of. Desolation. Um, Desolation.
Well, in
It's not
Dharma Bums, he
Desolation
goes
Painting.
on top of that mountain too, but I guess he wrote another book
Yeah,
specifically about the Desolation Mountain or whatever.
Desolation Angels. Yeah,
Uh,
I think it might be that. Yeah, you're right that the Desolation Angels um is more specifically about the time spent at the top of that mountain as the fire
hmm
lookout,
yeah,
whereas Dharma Bombs kind of has an
ends
episode of
there.
it with Gary Snyder or whoever, where they come down from the mountain, they go into San Francisco, they have a good old time.
Exactly. Exactly. Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, he had a big impact on me. I still every few years I'll reread On the Road, Dharma Bums, and Big Sur. Those were the three that I connected with the most and that I
Big
keep
Sur is
around.
amazing. I
Big Sur is very good.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I'm interested because I was going to ask you about any kind of paradigm shifting moments or even mystical or kind of uh uniquely spiritual types of experiences that you had, and you mentioned that you haven't necessarily had those. Well, so I'm just gonna throw that
Well,
out there once again. Is there anything there, or is there any kind of experiences that you've had that you felt kind of like in an embodied or emotional way connected with the divine, and you know
um, through prayer, I would say.
okay.
Um, but for me, it's not. I don't. I've never had mystical experiences in the sense of the sort of like, you read about sort of like saints and so on, whoever like who have had them. I love the saints, obviously that whole calendar I love,
Sure.
and some of them have those kind of experiences, and some of them don't.
Yeah.
Um, but I have a very, nothing exciting like that is happens in my life. It's hard work, and I've had to um, um, force myself. I don't know. It's force is the wrong word, because you do it because you want to, because you feel pulled
Yeah.
towards.
But
I
you've
mean, I'll
disciplined
speak
yourself.
about it as I well, somewhat. Yeah, I think that's it. Actually, I mean, um, uh, the action of the will, like the volition, has to be involved in the spiritual life, in a life of prayer. And
Hmm.
for Catholics, a prayer life is essential. It's at the heart of it. And for everybody, it's going to be different, of course, and that's beautiful. I mean, everybody's different. Everybody has different temperaments. They have different personalities. They have different imaginative and intellectual lives. They have different tastes and so on. So it's hard to talk about it except as it pertains to yourself.
Sure.
Um, to so I guess I'll do that. Um, but to answer your question, the more my prayer life increases, the um, the more at peace I become, the more um, happy I become. I suppose is not a bad way of putting it. But externally, I suppose it looks more like a more, a relatively more disciplined life. Like my life, if I didn't have a prayer life, my life sort of, um, it doesn't fall apart exactly. But what happens is you become more susceptible to the temptations that are particular to you as a person. You
Hmm.
know. But the more the more regularly I go to mass and to the sacraments, especially to confession and to the Eucharist,
Mm.
the more ordered and integrated my life feels, which is only really a side effect. It's not the goal to have an ordered and integrated life. The goal is to be close to Jesus Christ.
Mm.
Um, and you do that through prayer and through having I mean, Catholics talk about having a personal relationship with God, but that's the thing. That's what we believe. And you
Yeah.
do that through talking to Jesus. And you know what? I recite a lot of prayers. I mean, there's different ways of praying, even, of course, right? And you can just kind of like talk to Jesus in your heart however you want to. For
Hmm.
me, a good way of doing it is actually to recite prayers. Like I've begun saying the rosary a lot,
Hmm.
like rosary beads, and like there's the decades of the Hail Marys that you say and so on.
Uh-huh.
That's one big prayer that I say. The rosary, it takes about 20 or 25 minutes,
Okay.
and you're reciting on there. It's 10 Hail Marys, 5 different times. There's also Our Fathers sprinkled in there, and Glory Bees. But then there's other prayers that I've learned in the last 2 years that I used to know when I was a kid. Actually, I remember learning some of them when I was making my what we call the First Communion, or First Holy Eucharist. When you're about 7 or 8, you usually make it. Um, and I remember my mom. This was in Minnesota when we happened to be there at the time. I was that age, 6 or 7, and I remember she was helping me like cut and paste, like I don't know, make some sort of like picture of the wine out of grapes, and the bread. It was like construction paper. I just have the memory of making that.
Nice.
She
Yeah.
was helping me. Right, we were preparing to do that, so there's probably some assignment we had to
Yeah. Sure.
do. You know, and I remember her. Well, I don't know if she taught me those prayers, but I kind of associate the learning those prayers with that image in that memory. But I
Okay.
kind of late returned to those and started, you know, relearning them, and I use them when I'm, like, say, when I go to church and I'm waiting for mass to begin, or if I have some time after going to mass, then I say those prayers, and they help me.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting. I was gonna my very final question was gonna ask you about certain practices or rituals that you have. And so you kind of you that's what you've been talking about. So I kind of want to ask a little bit more about that now. Um so prayer and the Eucharist and confession and going to mass, those are big kind of practices that you said bring you peace or kind of enhance your relationship with Jesus, I guess, and your faith, and kind of even though you said it's not the goal necessarily, but it does end up making you feel like you have a more kind of ordered and integrated life. Um,
Yeah, exactly. It's not they're not the goal exactly, but I will say that I think that what's the word that I hear sometimes that the the source and summit of the Catholic life is the Eucharist. The
okay.
source and summit. It's so important because we believe in Catholics believe in the real presence of Christ in the transubstantiated host. You know,
Yeah.
so during the Mass, there's the liturgy of the Word, the liturgy of the Eucharist during the Mass. The liturgy of the Word is that the first, half of it where we hear the readings from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then there's
Hmm.
the Gospel reading. Then the priest usually gives a homily. Then after that's over, the liturgy of the Eucharist begins, which is the commemoration of the basically of the Last Supper,
Yeah.
which Christ told us to do. He said, "Remember, do this in memory of me." That's what he said to his disciples. So he
Yeah.
gave them his body and his blood in the forms of the bread and the wine. So when this transubstantiation happens, we believe that they say that the species is still the bread and wine, but in essence, in its deepest essence, it's now Christ Himself. And we take that in, we eat it, it becomes part of us, and so it's something that happens to you. That's what I think makes the Catholic Mass, like Catholicism itself, unique, is that all these sacraments, the seven sacraments, in fact, the Eucharist being the most important one, they're things that happen to you. They're not just sort of like symbols.
Hmm.
You're having something done to you by the divine,
Hmm.
and so you go to confession. You're absolved of your sins. You go and take the Eucharist. You don't have to do that every. You don't have to go to confession every time. They
Yeah.
say once a month, unless you're in mortal sin, which there's sort of technical definitions of those things.
Okay. Yeah, so sometimes you said there's different kinds of prayers. So sometimes you have more personal prayers. Sometimes you recite these traditional prayers, and maybe there was a period of time went by where you maybe didn't do those prayers as much, but now you've been kind of integrating them back, and they remind you of your childhood as well, especially that moment of creating that thing with your mom. Um, and the Eucharist is not just a symbolic thing or an abstract thing; it's a very embodied thing that happens to you when you do it. And I mean, there's so many questions I have, but I guess with the Eucharist, I'm curious, like, do you ever feel like you're kind of palpably in the presence of Christ during those moments?
Um, it's a hard question to answer, I suppose. I mean, in a sense, no. I mean,
Hmm.
um, you don't feel like some. I mean, I can only speak for myself.
Sure, yeah.
I don't I don't feel like some radical change in my being.
Okay.
I don't feel um, the host is a very light. It's a light kind of wafer, um,
Hmm.
and it's interesting how it feels when you take it. It dissolves um, on your tongue. You're not meant to sort of like chew the host.
Yeah.
You're supposed to just sort of let it sit on your tongue and dissolve. And it's funny. It's like I think about it sometimes. It's like there's something so modest about the communion host. It's so modest and sort of beautiful the way it just kind of disappears on your tongue after maybe like a minute, I would say. I mean, you sort of you take it and then you return to the pew where you're sitting, and you
Yeah.
kneel down and pray maybe a little bit. And after a minute or two, suddenly it's gone. If you just let it sit there. And it's like the way that God is, in a
Huh.
way. I mean,
Huh.
sometimes I think of it. I mean, like Jesus himself, whenever you read about him in the Gospels, like every single time, he's always like, he's never obtrusive. He always, of course, is powerful and has effect, but he's always um, modest and retiring.
Yeah.
And there's something about the way that is manifested in the communion host that matters. even
Okay.
if you don't have like a mystical experience, which
Sure,
you're not,
sure.
I don't think you're supposed to. I mean, faith, part of faith is that he doesn't want us to have like us to come to him because we love him. He doesn't want
Hmm.
us to like be coming to him because, wow, this feels really great. This
Sure,
feels
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Or like, here's this experience that I see and now I know that he's real.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that it doesn't sometimes happen. It does
Uh-huh.
happen to people, and it's happened to many people in history,
Yeah.
and it ought to happen to them if it happens, because that's the way he's ordered or ordained that it should happen.
Hmm.
Um, so that doesn't thing happen to me,
Yeah, I
but I
understand.
have a strong faith.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, I think that whether in Catholicism or other forms of Christianity or other religious traditions, I think there's a general kind of agreement usually that it we shouldn't be reliant on or overly desiring some like mind-shattering experience all the time because that's a dangerous approach to the spiritual path, I think. Um, and so
yeah.
yeah, there's a lot there, but I wanted to ask you just kind of to wrap back around to something that you said that I'm curious about. You know, you said that in your I guess in your late 20s, what kind of after periods of doubt maybe and questioning and trying to kind of figure out your own personal faith or in relationship to God, you said that it was reason really, and
Mm.
it was reason that kind of solidified it for you. So I'm curious, like, what did that look like? You know, what did your
Uh,
reason end up doing for you that kind of brought you back there?
well, I think that it would be mainly the books that I was reading and certain books that I'd read by certain people, and they would have been, I would say, I guess I would describe them as, we call them in the Catholic faith the doctors of the church.
Okay.
There's certain people throughout the 2 millennia of the church's history who have helped build or construct the sort of intellectual side of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Saint Augustine, I think he's fourth century, so pretty
Mm-hmm.
early.
Yeah.
I read a book of his called the Confessions.
Mm-hmm.
He's written several books, like City of God, on the Trinity. He's written, but this one, Confessions, which is kind of considered like one of the first autobiographies in the Western canon, because it's
Mm-hmm.
about his life. I mean, Augustine was, sort of notoriously kind of dissolute in his younger years, in his um, I don't know how old he was when he finally had his conversion, but I think for him it sort of happened slowly because he came sort of more and more interested in the faith. But maybe when he was in his late 20s or 30s or somewhere in there,
Yeah.
he was very intelligent man. He wanted to be a like a rhetorician. Like there
Mm-hmm.
was great orators in the ancient world, and
Yeah.
he was going to go to Milan, become a great orator. But his mother, so his dad was a he grew up in northern Africa. His mother was of, I can't remember, there's a term for the specific ethnicity they are there, but I can't remember it. But
Okay.
his mama was of one persuasion, and his father, I believe, was a Roman. Um, his mother early on became a Christian, and she saw Augustine's life going down a certain path of, as I said, sort of dissolute behavior, especially kind of in terms of lustfulness and so on. And she prayed for him for many years to have a conversion, and finally he eventually did. But he wrote this book, The Confessions, and it speaks to the it's about his own life and his growing up, and how he lived a certain way, and then it describes his intellectual formation and the things that persuaded him of the truth of Christianity and the truth of the faith and so on. He speaks of, of course, the scientific revolution happened, wasn't yet to happen for another 1,000 years or so until the Enlightenment. But I mean, they were already, there's always been a great tradition of reason and rationality, with the Greeks and so on. And so that
Yeah.
was all there for him to participate in. And So it was that's one example. I think of him because I guess he had a great effect on me. But that book,
Mm.
and other books, I would say Thomas Aquinas. What little I know of Thomas Aquinas has really affected me. He wrote a big book called the Summa Theologica, which is
Yeah.
um, in Latin, I think it means like all of the sort of theological tradition. And he was in the 1100s. He was a Dominican friar, and he was a great theologian. And he came up with certain proofs. We call them, proofs, I would say in quotes, for the existence of God. And these
Hmm.
is all like informed how how I came to that kind of. So I sort of eased back toward it
Yeah.
and settled into it.
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love books too. So books have played a big role in my, spiritual and intellectual formation as well. And I'm familiar with those figures and books that you talked about. I've read a little bit of both of them. From what I know of Thomas Aquinas, I actually really like a lot of his ideas. Um, and so, yeah, that makes sense. I guess on that topic, I'm curious, did you ever get into Meister Eckhart?
No, I don't think I did. I've heard that name and know of him, but I'm not really familiar with his work. Well,
Yeah, I'd
tell me
I'd
about him.
recommend. Well, he's considered like a Christian mystic, but um yeah, his writing is very interesting, and I know that even though he's a little his language and stuff is kind of obscure in a way, but apparently he was a very popular um I guess priest. I mean, I know he gave sermons or homilies like and I think a lot of those got turned in, transcribed into writing. But, he's usually
Mm,
kind of referenced as having certain parallels with certain Eastern thought too. So he was definitely a
mm.
devout Christian, but the way that he kind of um, you know, related and viewed the divine kind of had a Eastern touch to it. So yeah, I would recommend checking him
Yeah.
out. I think you'd probably like him.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
There's a lot that
bef
I haven't read.
yeah, yeah, me too. Me too. Always. Well, I wanted to kind of shift into more of the your creative practice and stuff. I don't want to leave
Sure.
the religious and spiritual stuff behind. I want to kind of see how these two fit together really. So, I
Hmm.
mean, I know that, well, you said before we started recording that your writing in the last couple of years has maybe become more philosophical and theological, perhaps. So first, I guess we can talk about your writing before we talk about your visual art. But with your writing,
Sure.
how do you see your relationship with kind of your religious faith and your writing content and your writing practice? How do those two relate to each other?
Um, I think that they do relate to each other, and I think that my earlier stuff it was less direct. Um, like the those three books that I wrote, the poetry and the fiction, it
Yeah.
was um it was a more of a like a dramatization of um maybe religious convictions that I already had, but
Mm,
that I wanted to subconsciously articulate in a fictive sort of way or a
yeah.
poetic sort of way.
Yeah.
Um, because I think that they are, I think that like one of the book The Three Sunrises, that's a book of fiction. It's three novellas. And that, to me that's a sort of strange book. Um, it's quite a violent book in some ways, and it's sort of like has a lot of inexplicable landscapes and vistas in it, and
Hmm.
but to me it's still a very religious book um, at the same time, or not really not in spite of it, but that was my way of approaching religious truth was in that way. because nothing is counter to really religious truth. Everything in the world, everything that can possibly happen or be imagined,
Hmm.
can some way um, be a reflection of it if it's shaped in a certain way.
Yeah, and it could be
Can
at least
somehow
looked
can
at through
somehow
that lens, of course.
mhm. And so I'm not sure, I'm not sure if ultimately it succeeds in kind of making of the world or making of reality the sort of sense that it, I wouldn't say tries to, because I don't think a book sort of tries to do something, but um, there is some sort of intent, of course. There's always artistic intent, even if it comes out of the subconscious in some kind of way, you know?
Sure, of
So I'm not sure if
course.
it accomplishes what it means to, but I think that you can still speak of it as trying to do that. The stuff that I've been writing much later, because that last book was almost 10 years ago now, it was 2015.
Yeah.
And I have written a bit of fiction that's different from that stuff. It's a lot more sort of calm, I would say, and a little more serenity in it, um,
Uh-huh.
just in a normal, everyday sense of that word. But that was like 4 or 5 years ago. I never published that book. I mean, I tried to, but I couldn't find
Mm.
anyone who was interested in it as of yet. There's that manuscript, and then the stuff that we mentioned as we were just talking before, the more philosophical and theological stuff. That is, well, I mentioned like the diaristic or journal form. It does have it is me talking out loud about like religion and art, and it's also me just talking about normal everyday stuff. I mean, like you and me mentioned the Pessoa,
Hmm.
Fernando Pessoa book, The Book of Disquiet, which from my very brief familiarity with that book, some of it is him walking out in the streets and talking about what he sees and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. And that's sort of what I've been doing a little bit in the. I've been working on this sort of very. It's turned into a quite a long sort of journal that I've been writing on my laptop. Um, I'd say it's probably under 100,000 words, but that's a lot for me. I've been
Yeah,
working
yeah,
on it
for
for the
sure.
past 4 or 5 years, and so it's a little more directly about religious stuff at times, and a
Okay.
little bit more directly about philosophical stuff at times, and also just about different things that I see or think about.
Yeah. Okay. So, so that project that's been kind of that you've been working on for 4 or 5 years, I guess, because yeah, I remember you telling me about it many years ago. You were just starting it, I guess.
Mhm.
And so that's mainly based on personal and kind of autobiographical, thoughts and moments and stuff. And I
Mhm.
think that your earlier work that I've read, it always, even some of the more kind of what I took to be a little like some of it was funny in a dry way, which
Mhm.
and I love that. I think that, the time I saw you read at 851 back in 2012, I guess, um, I was it was a perfect time to be introduced to your writing because I was at that time kind of trying to do certain similar stuff in my own writing, and kind of this minimalist, like very pared down, and sometimes dryly humorous. Um, so anyways, I think that that first book of yours influenced me at the time for sure, and I appreciate that. But I want to ask about some of your work, the tone and the imagery has a lot of gravity to it. That's one word
Mhm.
that's popping in my head. It feels like it has gravity to it, and there's a certain intensity to some of it, and definitely vivid. So I guess I'm curious, like the stuff that is not autobiographical, that is kind of imagery and scenes and situations and characters that are coming from seemingly your imagination. Like, do you it feels like you're accessing vivid parts of your imagination for sure. And I'm wondering, does that happen on the page as you're writing, or do you go into an imaginal space and kind of flesh it out before you put it on the page, or what's that process like?
I think generally for me, if I'm thinking of what you're describing, is that it happens on the page
Okay.
through the working through the working of language, or
Yeah.
through the through the manipulation of the sentence as you go along and write it,
Yeah.
as which that's just sort of the way it works. I mean, for me, but also I think for a lot of the writers that I've read, that I'll say the fiction writers that I've read, um, the sentence leads you to to the creation of scene. I mean, I think that when I started out writing long time ago, the mistake that I would make, or that I would run into, is trying to see a scene and be like, "Oh, this is a good, interesting scene. Let
Mm-hmm.
me put this down and record it."
Mm-hmm.
But almost inevitably, what happens when you try to do that, I've found, is that um, the scene feels artificial and wooden and
Yeah.
unsurprising in a way that, if it occurs in fiction, the fiction loses its life. It
Mm-hmm.
loses its liveliness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, for me, working in a sentence in fiction is, as you pay attention to the words you're putting down, you can't have too firm a grasp on where the sentence is leading you.
Yeah.
You have to let it surprise you in some kind of way, which is, I know it's a weird way of putting it. It's more like, because how can a sentence surprise you if you're the one writing it? Well, it does, in the sense that if you pay attention to the words and the punctuation, a very like sort of close up, zoomed in level,
Yeah.
and you think, where can this sentence turn, and should it turn here, or do I end it here, or do I keep it going for a while? You see the scene arising in front of your face, kind of your imaginative
Absolutely.
one, the one that you're imagining.
No, that doesn't
Yeah.
sound weird to me at all. That's a very similar experience as what I usually experience when I'm writing, and I generally for years I was setting out to surprise myself when, especially with poetry, because I've been writing poetry and philosophy, and the philosophy stuff's completely different for me. But with poetry and more kind of literary work, yeah, it's the same thing for me. It's happening on the page for the most part, and I'm surprising myself, and I love that. I love what you said. How can a sentence surprise you if you're the one writing it? That's beautiful, and that's kind of a weird paradox that makes a lot of sense to me. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's cool. It's interesting to hear about your process and how much it resonates with my own. And I think a lot of writers probably have a similar thing that happens. Um, and so I'm curious, like, as far as literary writers, who would you say are the ones that have inspired you or influenced you the most?
So many of them, so much stuff has, but the ones that come to mind a lot are Kafka, of course,
Yeah.
Flannery O'Connor,
Mm.
Kerouac, we already mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
Samuel Beckett, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov a lot. I love Chekhov. In fact, for me, like, Chekhov is a writer who I really don't really write like myself. I
Okay.
mean, to
Yeah.
me, he seems much different to me in some ways than I am. But
Yeah.
I just love him so much. I love his sort of personality that you can kind of feel, which is like a generous personality. He's sort of like, um, in a way, he's kind of non-judgmental of all
Mm.
of his characters, even the ones who who are kind of not all that nice. You feel as though that maybe not Chekhov himself, but the narrative intelligence behind the work is trying to
Mm.
like understand them.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
That's awesome. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's others too,
Well, yeah,
but
those
those would
those
be
all
ones.
make a lot of sense. I can see that. I can see why you like all those writers. I'm curious too that you didn't mention that I could see maybe some resonances, especially the first one I'm going to say, which is Lydia Davis. Um,
Oh yes,
okay, so you've gotten into Lydia Davis, right?
yeah. I think that she's one who, yeah. I remember I read her. She had a collection called was it Break It Down,
Yeah.
um, which was it was sort of an early book that I read. this was a long time ago. I would say it was close to like the year 2000 or shortly after there,
Mm-hmm.
that somebody gave to me, and I read it, and then I mean, it wasn't until sort of years, like 10 years later, that when I was sort of more seriously writing, I was like, oh, this I like what she's doing here. Because the thing about her is that she somebody else said this of her work. I can't remember if I read it as a blurb or something, but the way that
Mm-hmm.
what they said was that she kind of loosed. I'm taking the words. I'm changing the whatever they said and just
Okay.
remembering it wrong. But it was something like that she loosed the idea of fiction and story from kind of its traditional moorings, and like
Yeah.
she put in sort of like riddles and philosophical entries and jokes, and even like the Zen koans that you love so much.
Yeah.
Some of her work is very much like that,
Oh yeah,
even
for
if they're
sure.
a little bit longer. Um, but that kind of like freed me up to sort of see what fiction could do. I think for a long time I was like kind of stuck in this thing of like a story has to be this kind of thing,
Yeah, exactly.
which that kind of story is great too. I love kind of like
Of
traditional
course.
realism. And a lot of those writers that I mentioned are, like, sort of like Chekhov and Tolstoy, and they're kind of like traditional psychological realism. That's interesting
Mm,
too. But if you can't really write that, like I can't really do that.
mm.
So seeing someone else be literary in a different way was helpful to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. One way I used to think about that, I guess I still do, but like, certain writers give you permission. It's like she's the type of writer who
Yes.
gives you a lot of permission to do things that you didn't know you could do with
Yeah,
writing,
yeah.
as well as Russell Edson, who I was going to mention. Your work is not necessarily super similar, but there's some like parallels maybe. Did you ever get into him?
No, people have mentioned him to me, and I haven't
Yeah.
read him. So that's
Okay.
something else that's missing in what I should read.
Maybe.
That's
I feel like I've liked him less over the years. I used to really like him, but he is worth checking out. And it's talk about imagination unfolding on the page. He's definitely a writer like that. But the last one I wanted to
Did he
mention is
did he
Raymond
write
Carver.
stories? Oh
He
yeah,
writes
yeah, I
tiny
love him
little.
too.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I figured you like Raymond Carver.
And
I
his
reread a
Carver's
collection.
poetry is pretty good too, I think.
I've never gotten into Carver's poetry. I read a few poems from him, but I've always gravitated toward his short stories, which is interesting because I
Yeah.
don't read tons of fiction these days, but I always go back to Raymond Carver.
Which Carver stories do you remember that do you have some that you particularly really like?
Yeah, the first one that always stuck with me from college was Cathedral for sure.
Heck yeah,
Um,
that story is awesome.
yeah,
I don't care what anyone
Cathedral.
says about it.
What's that? What's
I'm just I feel like for a while I feel like for a while people were sort of making fun of Carver for his sort of. I mean, he was always like he's sort of ever present as an influence or a shadow in the MFA programs. But he's
uh-huh.
good for a reason.
Oh
And
yeah.
Cathedral's a beautiful story. I taught that in some when I used to teach classes. I would teach Cathedral that and a small good thing. Did
Yeah, I
you read
love that
that
one.
one?
Yeah, yeah, I love that one.
That's a beautiful one too. I didn't mean to
Yeah, that
interrupt you.
one's
Sorry. Go
the
ahead.
well, no, you're fine. Yeah, a small good thing, if I'm not mistaken, that was he has two versions of that. He had the bath and then a small
Yes,
good thing. The bath
exactly.
was more minimalist and then he fleshed it out a little bit.
Yeah, and what's amazing about that is the bath is. I mean, where he chooses to end that story, it ends in this completely dark,
Yeah,
place.
yeah,
Um, which is most of his stories. If you read them,
totally.
they're all quite depressing.
They're pretty dark,
But
yeah.
when he expands it into a small good thing, it's similar to cathedrals. This ends on this beautiful note of hope and sort of like forgiveness.
Yeah,
With the
exactly.
baker and the family that lose their child.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and I went to Argentina recently and I ended up going to a bookstore and I bought a William Blake book. I bought two books that I used to have that I ended up getting rid of because I've gotten rid of so many books like when I moved throughout the years and stuff. And then every once in a while I'm like, man, I really wish I still had that book. But I went to a bookstore in Argentina and I bought the William Blake book, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which I really like. and I bought Raymond Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love collection, which I used to have, but I no
Oh,
longer had. And I reread that book in the last few weeks ago. And I really liked it. I mean, I liked I was reminded of how good of a writer he is, but I was also reminded of
so good.
how dark his writing is, and it's almost a little too dark, not too dark for my taste these days, but I've been a little bit more mindful about what I ingest into my soul, so to speak, and I don't think I'll return
It
to
matters.
his short stories anytime soon. But Cathedral, yeah, you're right. So since he is such a dark writer, I really enjoy when he kind of takes it in a slightly more life-affirming direction. And Cathedral is always
Yes.
one that felt pretty spiritual to me for sure.
Yeah, it is.
I love where
Yeah,
it lands.
he
I
is.
love the
He's
ending of
great.
it. Well,
Yeah. I mean, you wonder
we
about.
have
Go ahead.
well, I was gonna say we have a few more minutes. And so finish your thought, and then I'm gonna ask you the last question here.
So, I was just gonna. What was I gonna say? It was something about Carver. Just about
Yeah,
like. I mean, you when you read about his life or you hear about his life, he what was it? He only lived to something like 50. He was an alcoholic until he was 40,
yeah.
and so lived the last 10 lives of his years sober. But he also developed, I think he died of lung cancer. So he had that for
Mm,
the last few years of his life. But I mean, those last years, he seemed to be quite happy. Um,
mm.
um, and and you wonder, like, sort of like the direction that his fiction, his sort of imaginative artistic life was headed. It was, I don't know what sort of poetry he was writing then, because I've read mostly his fiction, although I have read some
Yeah,
of his poems. Um, but I think Cathedral was in his sort of later stories. I don't know
that
when
makes
it
sense. I
was. I
think
think it
that's
was.
right.
I don't know if it was in his last collection, but it may have been. Um,
I think that might
yeah,
be right. I don't remember for sure, but I think I remember reading that that was in the last little chunk of his life there. And I knew that I knew he was an alcoholic, and then he stopped drinking. I didn't know it was the last 10 years of his life.
but
That makes sense. And
but he had written a lot before he got sober. Yeah, so he had written like when he wrote "Will You Please Be Quiet, Please." That's the really dark collection, and um, that that was his first book, and he was like I think he was sort of like still drinking a lot, and probably had a
right.
really hard life, dark life, hard life. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't want to spoil
it's
too
interesting
much.
to kind of look, try to assess I mean, obviously the condition of one's life plays a big role in the type of content that they're going to be creating. So yeah, that's a fascinating arc that maybe at the end of his life he was writing more, less dark stuff because he was in a less dark place, perhaps.
Yeah, it's
So
hard to write not dark stuff because you
yeah,
have to be honest too. You know what I
I
mean?
know.
You have to be honest, or it's not going to work. So
Yeah,
it's nice to know that there's a way of being honest artistically and still not be super dark.
exactly. Yeah, you're right. If you're trying to be honest, then that's going to be an aspect that you're bringing into the writing, and so. Yeah, I think it's important to kind of have a fullness there, but um I also yeah, I value um writers and thinkers who end up regardless of the suffering and darkness that is infused in reality that end up kind of, coming out the other end of that with some light.
Heck yes, me too.
So as a last
Yeah.
question, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned when I first reached out to you this time for a possible to get you on the podcast, you said that you've been trying to step back a little bit from being online and maybe being on social media specifically. So I wanted to just kind of ask you like and I totally understand that desire. But can you say a little bit about that? Why have you been kind of trying to step away and that sort of
Um,
thing?
I don't. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know why. probably for many reasons, or at least a few reasons.
Yeah.
Um, I think partly because it's easy to get too involved in the online world, I suppose, or at least
Yeah.
through social media. I mean, I don't have a whole lot of stuff. I have a Twitter account and an Instagram account, and I use my Instagram account to put my art on it. So I was doing that anyway. I was doing the calendar of saints last year,
Yeah.
and so I was always putting stuff on there. Um, um, I mean, it could just be. I feel a little bit like the state of the world is is um, is an is an occasion for people, or at least for myself, to um, try to examine or take stock of, or recognize what kind of person you have become, I have
Mm-hmm.
become. You know, what am I contributing to the world? I don't
Mm-hmm.
think really, I'm not trying to diminish like any of the writing or art I made, but I mean, I don't think that that's like I'm like, it's not all that important. My my books and my art, they're the little small things that I've done. Um, I'm proud of them, but I feel like it's just I'm not so interested in this moment. Which, when I say moment, I mean like the sort of the previous few years and the next coming years.
Yeah.
We're in some kind of moment where, to me, literature and arts is. I'll always love them. I mean, they're my passion, and I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to make a life out of it and become like a great artist and writer when I was younger. And I still want to make good art, and
Yeah.
writing, but maybe I don't have that particular gift in the way that I wanted it. But also, my eye is not on that right now. It's
Mm.
on there's something about the moment that we're in, or the shift that the you know the world and time is sort of undergoing right now, that um, wants us, or at least I feel is obligating me to sort of look at the world and myself in it and see what I'm contributing to it. And
Yeah.
my contribution would be one where we talked earlier about the spiritual life, and I need to really get myself right in that way. I feel that intensely, and so I'm not. I mean, I got to keep working on it, and
Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm trying. But that's really where my attention is. I think even like the calendar of saints was, I think, an attempt by me to shift my focus a little bit to
Okay.
something more explicitly religious.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I I used to use social media more. I used to be, I mean, I still, just like most of us, I use my phone all the time, probably too much, but I've tried to have a little bit, a more mindful relationship with those things. And I think that, yeah, kind of taking a step back from all of that is it's good for one's mental health. And I think that being too tangled up in it is usually bad for one's mental and spiritual health. So I totally feel you. And I've been trying to kind of, yeah, I try to be careful, like I said, about what I ingest these days and what I express and the ways that I digest. I've been thinking about this three-part thing, ingesting and digesting and expressing. And so I'm trying to just kind of yeah, have like maybe a wiser approach to those. That's the goal. So I feel you.
Heck yeah.
Well, Edward, this was super fun, man. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so
It,
much.
I really thank you. Thank you, Matthew. I really enjoyed this. I loved it. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
You too.
I enjoyed it so much.
It
It
was
was
a really
wonderful.
fun dialogue. I know we have a lot, we have a lot of overlaps. We have a lot to talk about, and it was really cool to kind of just hear about, your experience throughout the years with your religious orientation and your creativity and how the two overlap and all that stuff. So yeah, I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to answer those questions. So
Of
thank
course.
you.
Of course.
And
Thank you.
yeah, man. Well,
We have to
reach
get, I
out to
would
me at
like
any
to,
time.
let's stay in touch.
For
Okay.
sure. We
I
will.
will.
All right. Peace,
All right.
man. Take care.
Thank you. Okay,
Bye.
bye.